The night sky over southern Russia was calm, almost deceptively peaceful. Oil refinery lights glowed steadily in the distance, massive steel towers breathing fire like mechanical dragons that had done this same routine for decades. Workers inside the control rooms believed it would be another ordinary shift. No alarms, no warnings, no signs of danger. But far beyond the horizon, something had already been launched, something small, silent, and carrying consequences far larger than its size. This wasn't a missile you could track easily. This wasn't a jet screaming across radar screens. This was a drone, and it was coming fast. By the time Russian air defenses realized what was happening, it was already too late. Because what followed wasn't just an explosion, it was a message. And that message would shake energy markets, military planning rooms, and political power circles far beyond the refinery walls. For months, Ukraine had been quietly changing the rules of the war. While the world focused on front lines, trenches, and artillery duels, a different battlefield was opening in the shadows. Ukrainian engineers, intelligence officers, and drone operators were no longer thinking only about tanks and soldiers. They were thinking about fuel. About logistics. About the lifeblood that keeps a modern war machine alive. Oil refineries weren't just industrial facilities anymore. They were strategic targets. And Russia had many of them, spread deep inside its territory, once thought to be untouchable. The refinery that night was one of those symbols of security. Located hundreds of kilometers from the Ukrainian border, it processed thousands of barrels of crude oil every single day. Fuel from this site powered civilian transport, industrial machinery, and military vehicles alike. It fed pipelines, storage tanks, and supply chains that stretched across regions. Russian officials had repeatedly assured the public that such critical infrastructure was protected by layered air defenses. Patriot-style systems, electronic warfare, radar nets. But drones didn't play by old rules. The Ukrainian drone that crossed into Russian airspace didn't announce itself. It flew low, hugging terrain, designed to confuse radars and avoid detection. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't flashy. But it was precise. Guided by satellite navigation and real-time intelligence, it moved closer and closer to its target. Inside the refinery, no one noticed. Outside, the night remained quiet. Then, suddenly, everything changed. A flash cut through the darkness. A fireball erupted from one of the processing units. The explosion wasn't massive like a missile strike, but it was surgical. Flames climbed into the sky, smoke pouring upward in thick black columns. Shockwaves shattered nearby windows. Emergency alarms screamed into life. Workers ran. Fire suppression systems activated, but oil fires don't behave like ordinary blazes. They feed themselves. Within minutes, social media inside Russia began to light up with shaky videos, distant booms, and confused voices asking the same question: what just hit us? Russian authorities moved fast to control the narrative. Local officials initially claimed a technical malfunction. Others said debris from a downed drone had caused a small fire. But satellite images told a different story. So did thermal maps showing hotspots exactly where Ukrainian planners would have aimed. The damage wasn't accidental. It was intentional. And it wasn't isolated. This refinery strike was part of a growing pattern. Over the previous months, Ukrainian drones had struck oil depots, fuel storage tanks, gas processing facilities, and refineries across Russia. Some were close to the border. Others were deep inside Russian territory. Each attack followed a similar logic: hit fuel infrastructure, force shutdowns, disrupt supply chains, and create pressure that no amount of battlefield success could fully offset. What made this strike different was timing. Russia was already under strain. Sanctions had squeezed energy exports. Maintenance of aging infrastructure had become harder due to restricted access to Western technology. And winter energy demand was rising. Knocking even a single refinery offline didn't just mean local damage. It meant ripple effects across logistics networks. Inside the Kremlin, this was no longer something to ignore. Military planners understood what Ukraine was doing. Instead of trying to outgun Russia tank for tank, Ukraine was targeting the systems that made those tanks move. Fuel shortages don't show up immediately on the battlefield, but when they do, they are devastating. A tank without fuel is just metal. A jet without fuel never takes off. An army without fuel doesn't advance, it stalls. Russian air defense units were ordered to adapt. More systems were redeployed to protect refineries. Electronic warfare units were activated to jam drone guidance. But that created another problem. Every air defense system guarding a refinery was one less system guarding the front lines or major cities. Ukraine was forcing Russia to spread itself thinner, stretching defenses across an enormous territory. Meanwhile, Ukrainian officials remained deliberately vague. They neither fully confirmed nor denied responsibility. This ambiguity was strategic. It kept Russia guessing while allowing Ukraine to signal capability without crossing certain political red lines. Western allies watched closely. Some were uneasy about strikes deep inside Russia. Others quietly acknowledged the military logic behind them. Back at the refinery, the fire burned for hours. Emergency crews fought to contain it. Production was halted. Sections of the facility were shut down for inspection. Engineers assessed damage to pipelines and processing units. Even after the flames were extinguished, the refinery couldn't simply restart. Safety protocols required inspections, repairs, and regulatory approval. Days turned into weeks of reduced capacity. Energy markets noticed. Even small disruptions can cause fluctuations when confidence is shaken. Analysts began factoring drone strikes into their forecasts. Insurance costs for Russian energy infrastructure increased. Transport routes were reevaluated. What Ukraine had achieved with a relatively cheap drone would have cost millions using traditional military means. The psychological impact was just as important as the physical damage. Russian citizens, long told that the war was distant and controlled, now saw fires burning deep inside their own territory. Videos circulated online faster than officials could suppress them. The sense of invulnerability was cracking. If a refinery could be hit, what else could be? Russian responses followed quickly. Air raids on Ukrainian cities intensified. Missile and drone strikes targeted power grids, warehouses, and industrial zones. Moscow framed these attacks as retaliation. But beneath the rhetoric, there was concern. Ukraine had demonstrated reach, adaptability, and patience. Inside Ukraine, drone units became symbols of innovation. Operators worked in small teams, often far from the front lines, launching weapons that carried strategic weight. Engineers modified designs, increasing range and payload while keeping costs low. Each successful strike fed back into the system, improving future missions. The war was evolving. It was no longer just about territory. It was about endurance. About which side could sustain pressure longer. About whose economy could absorb disruption. Ukraine understood that it couldn't match Russia. Resource for resource. So it aimed where resources mattered most. As weeks passed, more reports emerged of refinery shutdowns, fuel rationing in certain regions, and logistical bottlenecks. Russian officials downplayed the effects, but internal documents told a harsher story. Military fuel allocations were being prioritized, leaving civilian sectors strained. Transport companies complained of shortages. Prices crept upward. Internationally, debates intensified. Were these strikes escalating the conflict? Or were they a logical response to a war already reshaping global norms? Military analysts pointed out that energy infrastructure had always been a wartime target. The difference now was accessibility. Drones had democratized long-range strike capability. For Ukraine, the refinery attack wasn't about spectacle. It was about pressure. Each drone launched forced Russia to spend far more on defense than Ukraine spent on offense. It was asymmetric warfare at its most effective. And the message was clear: distance no longer guaranteed safety. Back at that refinery, repairs continued under heavy security. Air defense systems ringed the facility. Soldiers guarded checkpoints. Radar trucks hummed through the night. But the calm had changed. Every strange sound, every flicker on a screen, carried tension. The war had arrived, not with tanks, but with a buzz barely heard before the fire began. As the smoke cleared, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a one-time incident. It was part of a new phase of the conflict. A phase where infrastructure was the front line, fuel was the weapon, and small machines could trigger massive consequences. And somewhere, already assembled, another drone was